Hi, this is Elliot from EO Nutrition, and in this video today we are going to be talking about how there is a very simple tool, a very kind of cheap, simple, effective method that you can be using on a regular basis to enhance your detoxification system. This method is actually utilizing Epsom salts baths, and there's a couple other tools that you can use with that to really support the way that your body is processing and eliminating toxins. So toxins is a bit of a buzzword right now, but what I'm referring to here is xenobiotic agents. So in other words, foreign chemicals, foreign substances that we are coming into contact with on a daily basis in our modern world. Some of these involve the volatile organic compounds. You have bisphenol A, which is usually found in plastics and which is actually a hormone disruptor and can have many damaging effects on the cellular level as well. So we are coming into contact with potentially thousands of toxins all of the time, and if the liver is unable to process this, if the cells are unable to process this, then what we essentially do is we store these toxins. And so sometimes they can be stored for very long periods of time, and they're only released when we initiate some kind of detoxification or when we have enough available resources to be able to process those through the liver, through the skin, or through the kidneys. And so in order to understand how we can use Epsom salts, we first need to look at the very basic mechanisms of how the body is processing these toxins, how we are storing them or eliminating them, and why this is going to be really important when we are considering how to use binders, how to use other methods to support detoxification. So first of all, to understand how and why this tool can be useful, we first need to examine the basic mechanisms of how we are absorbing those xenobiotics or toxins, how they're processed in the body, and then how they are effectively eliminated. And for the purpose of today's presentation, we're going to focus on toxins which are entering the body orally. So let's say that you've eaten some vegetables and they have been heavily sprayed with pesticides. This is one example. Or you've drunk some water from a plastic bottle. This is another example. So after ingesting some kind of toxin, these xenobiotics, basically they are being absorbed at different points throughout the GI tract. And in the intestine, we actually have specific transport proteins, and these are located on the membrane of the intestinal cells, and these facilitate like the pumping action, these kind of xenobiotic substances into the actual cells of the intestine, which are called the enterocytes. Okay, so these kind of proteins, I mean, you have lots of different classifications. You have monocarboxylate transport proteins, you have peptide transport proteins, organic anion and cation transporters. We're using these transporters to pump these xenobiotics into the enterocyte. Now, once they get into the enterocytes, some of those are actually metabolized on site. So we have a certain set of enzymes in the enterocyte itself, and these belong to the cytochrome P450 family. And there's also uridine diphosphate glucuronosyl transferase enzymes. These are abbreviated as UDP glucuronosyl transferases. Okay, so these enzymes are responsible for transforming toxins in some way. And so xenobiotics which enter into the enterocytes really have three potential fates. One of those is to be transformed by these enzymes and actually spat back into the lumen of the gut, where they can be excreted via the feces. Likewise, there are also sometimes when actually the cells will hold on to that toxin, and because there is a very high turnover rate in the cells of the gut, the toxin or the xenobiotic which is stored within the cells will actually be shed off and passed again through the feces. But alternatively, and this is happening with many xenobiotic agents, is that after they are absorbed into the enterocytes, they are transported into the portal vein, which means they're transported into the blood, the circulatory system, which is headed directly for the liver. And the way that they are transported is again through certain types of transport proteins. But essentially all you need to know is that these proteins are getting the toxins from the cells and actually directly into the bloodstream. And so for those who don't know, we have a separate circulatory system going from the gut directly to the liver, and this is separate from systemic circulation. The purpose of this is designed to allow the body to effectively filter the toxins and the crap that's coming from the gut through passing it through the liver first. Because we don't want the stuff that's coming directly from the gut to get into systemic circulation. It needs to first be assessed and effectively dealt with by the liver, because the liver is really the main protector organ. It's the organ which is going to decide what is allowed to get into systemic circulation and what isn't. Really, I mean, ultimately, the purpose of this is to protect the rest of the body, protect the other organs. Now, when these xenobiotics reach the liver, they are then going to be transformed in some way. They're going to be processed, and then they can be effectively dealt with. Okay, so these xenobiotics traveling through that portal vein, in that portal circulation, what they effectively need to do is to get into the hepatocyte. So the hepatocyte is the cell in the liver, which is where all of the action occurs. This is where we are going to be transforming these toxins. And so you need to be able to basically transport the stuff coming from the blood and into the liver. The way we are doing that, again, you probably guessed it, is we are using another set of proteins. The function of these proteins is to translocate the xenobiotic agent across the sinusoidal or basolateral membrane of the liver into the liver cell itself, okay, the hepatocyte. So we have an influx of toxins coming from circulation being pushed through the membrane into the hepatocyte through all of these different transport proteins. And essentially, once you're inside the hepatocyte, this is where the action occurs. We use several different phases or several different steps in activating toxins so that they can be effectively dealt with and eliminated. And so the first step is referred to as phase 1, and this is using certain enzymes, mostly from the cytochrome P450 family. And what we're doing is we are using oxidation, reduction, hydrolysis, all of these kinds of chemical reactions, and we are activating these toxins to prepare them for the next phase. Now, the next phase is called phase 2, and we are using a variety of kind of amino acids. We can use various kind of antioxidants like glutathione. We can use sulfate. We can use lots of different substances. And what we're doing is we're binding that activated toxin in what is called a conjugation reaction. Okay, so we are conjugating them. We are binding, for instance, in sulfation, we will bind a sulfate with this toxin, and this means that it is prepared to be excreted. So it's much easier when we bind it, and we can actually increase that water solubility so that we can get it through the kidneys or we can get it out through the feces. There are many types of phase 2 reactions. These include glucuronidation, acetylation, sulfation. We have conjugation with various amino acids. Methylation is involved in this, and also the conjugation with the master antioxidant, which is glutathione. Now, the rate at which you do this is going to depend on substrate availability, which means that if you want to activate sulfation, you are going to need enough sulfate. If you want to activate glycination, you need enough glycine. Likewise, it's important to understand that you are using different types of phase 2 processes for different types of substances. There is also another phase of detoxification, and it's usually overlooked. This is actually referred to as phase 3, and this is specifically looking at how we are taking toxins after they have been conjugated, and actually what we're doing is we need to transport them across the cell membrane to get to where they need to be. So Dr. Chris Shade at Quicksilver Scientific Laboratories has done many videos on this and written about this extensively in the past, but it's important just to go over the basics here. So once we've conjugated these toxins, we need to get them out of the hepatocyte, either back into the blood or into the bile, where they can either go to the kidney or through the bile, they are going to go through the gut, into the feces and into the toilet. The way we're getting it from the hepatocyte is via transporters on the canalicular membrane, and that's going to be transporting these toxins into the bile duct. And now to get toxins out through the bile, we need to have sufficient fluidity of the bile. This is very, very, very important. And one of the actually most important factors is having enough phosphatidylcholine. Inadequate intake of phosphatidylcholine is actually going to contribute to impaired bile synthesis or impaired bile excretion. An increased intake of phosphatidylcholine has been shown to be very protective for the liver, protect it from liver damage, and also improve bile secretion. And so we see here how the liver plays a central role in really taking those toxins from the gut into that separate circulatory system, dealing with them in whatever way is necessary. Phase 1, phase 2, transformation processes, conjugation, and then we're passing it through those transporters back into the bile, or alternatively going into the blood and to the kidneys, and that way we can effectively detoxify what needs to be gone. However, it's not always as simple as that. Essentially, there is the problem of reabsorption. You see, there are several mechanisms by which toxins which are conjugated in the bile and actually dumped into the gut can then become reabsorbed. So this is one factor which is potentially going to place a burden on someone's body, is if they are detoxifying these things, they are trying to eliminate these toxins, but then they are actually reabsorbing them. Let's say they have slow motility. Let's say that they are chronically constipated. This means that it's very likely that someone is going to be reabsorbing these toxins despite their ability to try, or despite their attempts to try to eliminate them through the bile. There's also the problem that when you have an acute overburden, or when hepatocytes are depleting some kind of nutrient which they need to be able to conjugate these toxins with, you get this acutely overburdened system. And essentially what happens then is there are several mechanisms by which these toxicants can actually escape into the systemic circulation. And once they go there, then the body needs to find a way to store these safely. Because you see, the liver only has a certain capacity to deal with or filter toxins. Okay, if it's acutely overburdened, or if it's chronically overburdened, this might be due to some kind of nutrient insufficiency. For instance, if you don't have enough glycine, if you don't have enough sulfate, if you don't have enough glutathione, then what can happen is this actually reduces the function, or reduces the ability of those hepatocytes to effectively transform those toxins. If it can't detoxify them in that given moment, then it will preferentially store them in the adipose tissue, and they will potentially be stored there for a very long time. Okay, now this is safer than having the toxicant come into contact with the internal organs. But essentially, this is a second best option, because ideally we would have dealt with them by the liver, but when the liver can't deal with them in that moment, then we need to do something else with them, and what we're going to do is we're going to store them in the fat. So now that we have a basic understanding of how this detoxification system is working, here we're going to look at how Epsom salts fit into the picture. So remember that I said before, phase 2 conjugation reactions are determined by the capacity. They're determined by the nutrient availability. Sulfation is one of those conjugation reactions. And if we look at the composition of Epsom salts are actually magnesium sulfate. This means it's magnesium bound with inorganic sulfate, which is exactly the same thing that we are utilizing in those phase 2 conjugation reactions in the liver. And the sulfate, the way that we're using sulfate is we are activating it by ATP to produce something called PAPs. Okay, now what this is going to do is it's going to bind with things in the liver, and then it is going to carry them out through the urine or through the bile and eventually through the feces. So sulfation is extraordinarily important for liver detoxification. Research by Dr. Rosemary Waring has shown that sitting in an Epsom salts bath when the water is hot and there's approximately 3 to 4 cups of Epsom salts per bath, this is actually being absorbed transdermally through the skin, and it's raising plasma sulfate. Now, interestingly, plasma sulfate has been shown to be low in autism. It's been shown to be low in rheumatoid arthritis and a couple other diseases. And so plasma sulfate is potentially going to be a marker that you are measuring for someone's overall sulfation capacity, or whether they are deficient in sulfate. One of the other markers that you can actually look for is the cysteine to sulfate ratio, because the way that we are making sulfate, or that we can make sulfate, is actually by the transsulfuration cycle, where we're taking cysteine and making it into sulfate. But the cysteine to sulfate ratio is elevated in many different people who suffer from chronic disease. And what this means, when cysteine to sulfate is elevated, that means that we are not taking cysteine and making sufficient amounts of sulfate. Now, elevated or increased plasma sulfate is theoretically going to increase the availability of sulfate in the liver. Remember that we said that phase 2 conjugation reactions are determined by the nutrient availability. And so sulfate, if we are providing extra levels of sulfate, then this is potentially going to activate that process of phase 2 detoxification. This means that we are conjugating sulfate with toxins, and then assuming we've got enough phosphatidylcholine, we're carrying it back out into the bile. And so this is just one of the ways that actually having an Epsom salts bath is potentially going to really kickstart that phase 2 detoxification. Likewise, a hot bath in conjunction with increasing plasma sulfate is also going to effectively increase body temperature. It's interesting because lipophilic xenobiotics, which we store in our adipose tissue, are actually going to be liberated when we are increasing that body temperature. Okay, and so this is one of the reasons why sauna is said to be so effective, or said to be so healthy. But bathing in really hot water is going to have a similar effect. Now, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be sweating, and sweating is one of the most effective ways to detoxify these kind of toxins. But also the elevated body temperature is going to release these xenobiotics from those adipose stores. They're going to go into circulation, and they can either be excreted out through the sweat or packaged up by the liver, let's say in sulfation, and going to be excreted elsewhere. And so by getting in a really hot bath, providing the body with a big dose of sulfate, likewise raising body temperature and everything that comes with that, then we are potentially going to be dumping lots of toxin conjugates through the bile and into the gut. And if you recall me saying before, we really don't want to reabsorb this stuff. In fact, ideally, we want it to be gone as soon as possible. And so one of the ways that we can prevent reabsorption is actually to use certain types of binders. So there is one kind of binder which is called activated charcoal. Activated charcoal is a certain type of carbon which has been known for decades to be a very strong adsorbent, which means that it can effectively bind with a wide variety of toxic substances. It can bind with endotoxin, mycotoxins, pesticides, herbicides, benzene, lots of other volatile organic compounds as well. There's also another kind of binder that you could use, and this is bentonite clay. Bentonite has been shown to bind things like BPA, other kind of mycotoxins, and generally lots of different things which are potentially going to be liberated when you are increasing that body temperature and increasing that bile flow. So what I generally recommend is taking a teaspoon around 15 minutes in some water before you get into the bath. You take that just simply in a glass of water and then do the same thing maybe 10 minutes after the bath as well. You want to be sat in the bath for at least 20 minutes with around 3 to 4 cups of Epsom salts, and the temperature should be as hot as you can possibly bear. With hot water, you are going to be activating the sweating. So you're going to be sweating a lot. You're going to be very hot. And ideally, you're going to be absorbing as much sulfate as possible. Doing this 3 to 4 times a week is theoretically going to support that liver detoxification. It's going to prevent the reabsorption of what you do liberate, and it's going to be increasing sulfate. So now I hope that you can understand why I am such a massive fan of Epsom salts baths. They're really cheap, for one, and they are readily accessible to most people. Likewise, most people also have access to running water, hot running water, and also have a bath. So it would kind of seem like a waste not to make use of this very effective tool to really kickstart the liberation of those lipophilic compounds, to boost plasma sulfate, which is potentially going to increase that sulfation pathway. And at the same time, if you're using binders just before or after, then you are going to be mopping up whatever has been liberated and dumped into the gut. Now, whilst this may not fix your problem, so to speak, it's going to do a lot of the groundwork. It's going to help in some way. And I personally find that after I have these baths myself, I generally feel much better. So thanks for watching. If you like this video or you found it helpful, please like my page. I'm on Facebook as EO Nutrition. You can find my website as www.eonutrition.co.uk. And please subscribe because I will be making more videos like this in the future. If you have any video requests, send them through to me either in the comments section or on my email, and I will do my best to come up with something based on that. So thanks again, and I will see you next time.